They didn't just stink, they celebrated it. Forget everything you know about hygiene. Because in the Middle Ages, being clean wasn't just rare, it was suspicious. Bathing too often was considered dangerous, even sinful. And if you think that's gross, wait until you hear why. After the fall of Rome, the art of bathing collapsed with the empire. Public bathhouses turned into dens of disease, gossip, and temptation. Monks warned that water could open the body to sin, and the devil apparently traveled through steam, so people traded soap for prayer, perfume for holiness, and hoped no one noticed the smell. From noble courts drenched in rose oil to peasants who thought rivers were cursed, every class had its own version of clean, and most of them would make you gag. Tonight, we dive into the filth and faith of the Middle Ages, the wild, smelly truth about how people really lived, loved, and avoided baths for centuries. Before we dive in, or maybe not, like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Our medieval village keeps growing, one dirty story at a time. Before the Middle Ages began to stink, the world actually smelled divine. In ancient Rome, bathing wasn't just hygiene, it was culture. Every city had public baths, heated floors, marble pools, and oils imported from across the empire. People met friends there, discussed politics, and spent hours soaking in luxury. Cleanliness was a sign of civilization. But when Rome fell, the water stopped running. The aqueducts broke, the bathhouses crumbled, and the habit of washing disappeared with the empire. The people who inherited Europe weren't just poorer, they were terrified. Because to them, the collapse of Rome wasn't just the fall of a city, it was punishment. And so began a 1,000-year battle between cleanliness and faith. Early medieval thinkers started to believe that the body was a trap for the soul. If you cared too much about washing it, you were feeding vanity. If you bathed too often, you were tempting sin. Some monks even claimed that water opened the pores, gateways through which demons could enter. So instead of washing, they prayed. Instead of soap, they used silence. The Roman baths that once echoed with laughter and poetry became haunted ruins. In some places, the church banned them entirely, calling them houses of lust. What had once been a social ritual turned into scandal. If you were caught bathing with someone else, it wasn't seen as hygiene. It was heresy. But dirt had its defenders. Writers from the time began to describe filth as a mark of humility. Saints bragged about how long they had gone without washing. One holy man was said to have never changed his clothes or bathed for 40 years, and people came to kiss his hands as proof of purity. The less you smelled like earth, the closer you were to heaven. Of course, not everyone agreed. The nobles still missed the Roman luxury. Kings and queens built private bath chambers, filling them with scented herbs and rose petals to mask the stench. But these baths were rare and symbolic, more about seduction than sanitation. Perfume became the new cleanliness. If you smelled like lavender, no one would dare ask when you last touched water. For common folk, bathing was nearly impossible. Houses had no plumbing, rivers were filthy, and water was precious. People washed their hands and faces, sometimes their feet, but never their whole bodies. A full bath was a once-a-year event, often on Easter, a spiritual cleansing, not a physical one. The rest of the year they covered the smell with layers of clothing and prayers, and so as centuries passed, Europe learned to live in its own odor. The age of stone castles and shining knights began on foundations of mud and sweat. It wasn't that people didn't care, it was that they were afraid. Afraid of water, afraid of disease, and most of all, afraid of appearing sinful in a world that valued the invisible soul over the visible body. The Romans had washed to honor life. The medievals avoided it to honor death. And that's how the cleanest civilization in history gave birth to the dirtiest one. If the Romans had turned bathing into art, the medievals turned it into gossip. In towns that still had working baths, mostly in France, Germany, and parts of England, stepping inside was like stepping into another world. Steam filled the air, candles flickered on wet stone walls, and the smell of herbs, sweat, and something else, temptation, lingered everywhere. Men and women bathed together, at least in the early centuries. They brought wine, food, and instruments. Some even hired musicians to play while they soaked. The baths became a strange mix of hygiene, celebration, and seduction. A good soak could easily turn into something more carnal. That didn't go unnoticed. The church soon declared war on the bathhouses. Priests called them dens of sin, claiming that every drop of water carried more than dirt. It carried desire. Moralists preached that Clean flesh invited unclean thoughts, and soon the baths were seen as gateways to damnation. And yet, people kept going, because nothing feels holier than doing what's forbidden. In many towns, bathhouses began to serve a double purpose. During the day, they were respectable places for washing and gossip. At night, they were brothels with buckets. The same steam that hid soap bubbles also hid secrets. Kings, merchants, monks, all slipped through the doors under cover of darkness. If walls could talk, the bathhouses would have confessed more sins than any church. Still, there was something almost magical about them. They were warm, loud, and alive, rare comfort in a cold, filthy world. People came not just to clean their bodies, but to feel human again. For peasants who spent their lives covered in mud, a bath was paradise. For nobles, it was theatre, a place to be seen, to show off scented oils and exotic perfumes. But with pleasure came danger. By the 14th century, Europe was haunted by a new terror, the plague. People began to believe that hot water opened the body's pores, letting disease seep in. The same baths that once promised health now reeked of death. One by one, the steam houses shut down, their doors sealed with superstition and fear. The last brave souls who entered came out coughing, if they came out at all. When the baths finally disappeared, something shifted. Cleanliness no longer meant purity, it meant risk. Doctors and priests agreed. It was safer to stay dirty and alive than clean and damned. And so the medieval man chose dust over water, perfume over soap, and sin over salvation. What began as luxury ended as legend. And as the centuries rolled on, the scent of lavender and lust faded into myth, leaving behind the strange truth that, in the Middle Ages, the cleanest act of all was not to wash. If you couldn't be clean, you could at least smell expensive. In the royal courts of the Middle Ages, hygiene became theatre. Perfume was no longer a luxury, it was survival. The stink of sweat, fur, wine, and smoke clung to everything, clothes, hair, even the walls. So nobles fought back the only way they could, with fragrance. They burned incense in their chambers until the air looked hazy with holiness. They poured rose water on their hands, rubbed lavender oil on their necks, and stuffed herbs inside their clothes. Some even carried small bags filled with cinnamon and dried flowers, called pomanders, to hold against their noses whenever someone less noble walked by. It wasn't just a smell, it was a statement. The rich didn't need to wash. They could afford to pretend they were clean. Clothing became a second skin of deception. The outer layers were rarely washed, only sprayed with oils and sprinkled with powders made from ground iris root, musk, or even crushed pearls. The scent was strong enough to make eyes water, and that was the point. If you could make others dizzy, they wouldn't notice you hadn't seen a bath in months. But the smell wasn't just about vanity. It was about hierarchy. Odor defined who you were. Peasants smelled like work, earth animals smoke. Nobles smelled like heaven, roses, spice, and deceit. To smell good was to be good. It was moral superiority in liquid form. There was also fear behind the fragrance. Doctors of the time believed that bad air caused disease, what they called miasma. So perfume wasn't just pleasant, it was protection. People believed that strong smells could drive away sickness. If plague approached, nobles drowned themselves in perfume, hoping the scent would confuse death itself. Royal perfumes became political tools. Kings had signature scents made by alchemists. A whiff of their clothes could announce their presence before they entered a room. Queens were expected to smell divine, a reminder of purity and power wrapped in one. The court was a cloud of sweetness masking the rot beneath. Meanwhile, commoners did what they could. They chewed mint leaves, rubbed vinegar on their skin, or simply stood downwind from the nobles. They couldn't afford luxury or illusion. Their smell was truth, and that made them invisible. The irony is that in trying to escape reality, the upper class made it worse. The mix of sweat, perfume, and oil created an odor that was less divine and more unforgettable. Chroniclers of the time wrote that stepping into a noble's hall was like entering a garden that had died in summer. And yet for centuries this became the definition of elegance. Cleanliness was no longer measured by water, but by how strong your perfume was. The stink of pride smelled just fine, as long as it was expensive. It's hard to believe, but there was a time when being dirty meant you were doing everything right. By the 14th century, the world had changed, and so had its fears. Plagues swept through Europe like invisible armies, leaving entire towns empty. Doctors, desperate for explanations, looked for patterns, and they decided that the clean were the first to die. They noticed something strange. Those who bathed regularly, the rich, the curious, the modern, often fell ill faster. It didn't take much imagination to find a culprit: the water. To the medieval mind, the logic was clear. Bathing opened the skin's pores, and if you opened your body, the disease could walk right in. So to stay healthy, you had to stay sealed, covered in layers of sweat, dust, and divine protection. Cleanliness became dangerous, and filth became a shield. Medical texts from the time are full of bizarre advice. One doctor wrote that washing your body softens the flesh and weakens the spirit. Another claimed that bathing during plague season was a slow form of suicide. So people obeyed. They stopped bathing, closed the windows, and carried little balls of perfume and herbs to filter the air. If you smelled bad, at least you smelled alive. Even the church got involved. Priests warned that water could wash away not only dirt but faith. The holy body was meant to be preserved, not polished. Many monasteries banned bathing except for medical emergencies, and even then, monks were told to pray afterward, as if apologizing to God for touching water. So of course, the irony is that filth didn't protect anyone. It just made things worse. Parasites, infections, and diseases thrived on the very dirt people worshipped. But superstition always beats science when fear takes control, and fear ruled the Middle Ages. Some took the logic even further. They believed dirt could block evil. Peasants rubbed ash and mud on their skin before harvest rituals, calling it armor of the earth. Knights returning from battle refused to bathe for weeks, thinking the blood and sweat of victory made them invincible. Even queens wore the same perfume-soaked dresses for months, confident that divine odor would protect them from plague. And when the Black Death hit, everything collapsed. The bathhouses closed, the rivers were feared, even rain was seen as a curse, proof that God was trying to drown a sinful world. Europe locked itself in a cage of its own making, trapped between faith, fear, and filth. By the late Middle Ages, a strange new idea had taken root, that cleanliness was not just foolish, but dangerous. To stay safe, people built walls around their homes, around their minds, and even around their own skin. The world that once believed in divine water now believed in holy dirt. And that, more than any plague, was the true infection of the Middle Ages. For centuries, Europe had worshipped dirt. They had called it holy, protective, and pure. But filth has an expiration date. And by the end of the Middle Ages, the stench of fear finally began to fade. The Renaissance arrived like a breeze through a window that had been closed for too long. Suddenly, people remembered that the human body wasn't just a vessel of sin, it was art. Painters painted it, sculptors glorified it, and thinkers studied it. If the body was beautiful, maybe it was worth cleaning again. Science returned, timid at first, then bold. Doctors began to question the old superstitions. They rediscovered Roman texts, read about aqueducts, herbs, and the healing power of water. Cleanliness, they said, wasn't dangerous. It was logical. The body wasn't an open door to demons. It was a system that needed care. Slowly, bathhouses reopened, smaller, quieter, and more private. Perfume remained, but this time as luxury, not necessity. People started washing their hands before meals, faces before prayer, and eventually whole bodies before seeing each other. Soap returned to Europe like a forgotten treasure, and those who used it were seen not as sinners, but as civilized. The nobility led the way, as always, but for once their vanity served a good purpose. Clean skin became fashionable. Scented baths became signs of wealth and progress, not scandal. Washing was no longer rebellion, it was refinement. By the 16th century, water was no longer feared, it was adored. Fountains appeared in city squares. Artists painted rivers as symbols of life again, and the same civilization that once avoided bathing finally began to celebrate it once more, as pleasure, beauty, and dignity. But even then, the past never truly left. The fear lingered in shadows, whispering that comfort breeds weakness, that indulgence invites danger. The Middle Ages may have ended, but the mindset survived, hidden in the corners of every superstition we still carry today. Yet something beautiful was reborn in that transition. The rediscovery of water wasn't just about hygiene. It was about humanity reclaiming itself, washing away centuries of guilt and stepping into the light, one drop at a time. And perhaps that's the real story of the Middle Ages. Not just about what people lost, but about what they finally dared to touch again, the sacredness of their own skin. The Middle Ages feared water, but maybe not because of disease. Maybe they feared what it revealed, because when the dirt is gone, there's nothing left to hide behind. No mask, no excuse, no divine protection, just the truth of being human. For 1,000 years, people wore their fear like a second skin. They believed filth made them safe, that ignorance made them holy. But time, like water, always finds a way through the cracks, and when it did, it washed away more than dirt. It cleansed the mind. Cleanliness returned not as luxury, but as liberation. To touch water was to touch life again. And maybe, in some strange way, every bath we take today is a quiet rebellion against fear, against superstition, against the madness of forgetting what we are. Thank you for watching Medieval Crazy History. If this story made you look at history and maybe your next shower in a little differently, leave a like, subscribe, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'll meet again in another strange and forgotten corner of the Dark Ages.